In this video, we're going to discuss a special trick you can use to help remember the trig derivatives more easily. And by the way, this also works on the inverse trig derivatives. If you understand these rules, you only have to memorize half of what you normally would. So let's get started. First off, let's see if you remember what the 6 trig derivatives are. So go ahead and pause this video and see if you can fill in the blanks for these. So there you go. These are the answers. Now, if you got these wrong, or even if you remembered them correctly, but not easily and automatically, you might want to stick around for the rest of the video to see the trick to remember these more easily. But if you got these easily, then you can probably just skip the video. So to get started, let's see if you can recognize a pattern between these 3 pairs of trig functions. So sine, cosine, secant, cosecant, tangent, cotangent. Imagine that you already know the ones on the left and see if you can get from each one on the left to its corresponding pair on the right by using the same rule. So see if you can find one rule or one set of rules that gets you from these 3 on the left to the other ones on the right. Because if you can find that, then you only have to remember that half of them. And by the way, a rule does exist that does this. And this is what we'll talk about in a minute. But go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure out the pattern for yourself before we dive in. Now, before we dive into the exact rules, let's take a brief detour into something called cofunctions from trigonometry. Now, these are one of the more obscure topics in a trigonometry class, but they do have certain uses, so they are useful in certain cases. Now, there's a whole rabbit hole I could go down about, exactly what cofunctions are, like all their interesting trig properties and these identities that we're showing here. These are the actual cofunction trig identities, but we don't need to worry about any of that. If you want, you can research that yourself, and I'll just give you a hint. The CO in the word cofunction, the CO stands for complementary, as in complementary angles. So there's something very deep with right triangles, basically, where the complements or complementary angles to the angle you're taking your trig functions of is involved somehow in these identities. That's basically the idea. Again, we can expand on that a lot, but I won't do that here. All we really need to be able to do here is to be able to identify for a certain function, what its cofunction is. So that's what we're going to do here. And to get started, let me just ask, have you ever noticed that 3 of the trig functions are literally the exact same words as the other 3, except they have the letter CO in front of them? So sine, cosine, secant, cosecant, tangent, cotangent. What I usually find is that students have actually not recognized this before. And I know I hadn't before I first stumbled onto this. But basically, this is not a coincidence. The reason for this is because these are cofunctions. So for example, sine has a cofunction of cosine. Secant has a cofunction of cosecant. Tangent has a cofunction of cotangent. So these are all pairs, in other words. Sine and cosine are pairs, secant and cosecant are pairs, tangent and cotangent are pairs. So if you want to be able to figure out the cofunction for a specific trig function, there's really 2 rules. One rule is if it starts with CO, get rid of the CO. So like cosine, if I want to find the cofunction of cosine, it starts with CO, so get rid of CO, so sine. So sine is the cofunction of cosine. And then the opposite would be if it does not start with CO, the rule is add it. So tangent, what's the cofunction of tangent? Well, it does not start with CO, so add CO, cotangent. So that's all you really need to be able to do. You just need to be able to recognize these pairs. If you understand that, then these rules that we go over next are going to make sense. So now that you understand how to find cofunctions, these are the rules you need to get half of the trig derivatives, assuming you already understand the other half, or you've remembered or memorized the other half. So basically, we memorized the first 3, and then you can do these 2 rules. Rule number 1 is replace every function with its cofunction, and then make it negative. Those are the only 2 rules you need. So now let's actually apply these and see how this works. First, remember, we have to remember these 3 on the left. So you still have to memorize half of them. Again, there are other ways. If you forget some of these, like if you forget the derivative of secant or tangent, there are ways to recover from that. We'll discuss that in other videos. But for now, let's assume that you memorized the half of them. You can get to the other half of them with these rules. So for example, let's start on the first one. So here's the first one that we remember, and we want to figure out what the derivative of cosine is. So what's the rule? Rule number 1 is replace every function with its cofunction. So here, sine, so sine derivative sine gets replaced with its cofunction, which is, remember the rules, if the trig function starts with CO, take away those letters. If it does not start with CO, add those letters. And then that's the trig function that is the cofunction of the original one. So sine goes to cosine. So instead of sine derivative, it's cosine derivative. And then instead of cosine, well, remember what's its cofunction? It starts with CO, so take away that. Cosine becomes sine. So sine goes to cosine goes to sine. That's rule number one. Replace every function with its cofunction. And then rule number two is make it negative. So we add a negative sign or multiply by -1, if you want to think of it like that. So there you go. If you can remember this one on the left and you understand these two rules, you can get the other one on the right, this derivative of cosine. So you don't have to remember the derivative of cosine anymore if you remember these rules instead. If you remember the derivative of secant, let's do the same rule. So secant goes to cosecant, that's its cofunction. Secant goes to cosecant, that's its cofunction. Tangent goes to cotangent, that's its cofunction. And then make it negative. Tangent goes to cotangent, that's its cofunction. Secant goes to cosecant, and it'll be cosecant squared. That's rule number one, and then make it negative is rule number two. So there you go. You don't have to remember these ones on the right if you rote memorize only the ones on the left and remember these rules. So there you go. That can cut down the amount that you have to remember, and in my opinion, it's a lot cleaner. It's a lot easier to actually remember it. However, there's also one other benefit that we get if you remember this trick. The benefit, redo. And that is that it also works on the inverse trig functions. So if you apply the same rules, for example, for the inverse trig functions, if you remember these three on the left, these are the positive versions, in other words, you can get to the other three on the right with the same rules. So instead of sine, so arc sine, it's going to be arc cosine for the derivative, and then make it negative. Secant, cosecant, make it negative. Tangent, cotangent, make it negative. And basically, for the inverse trig derivatives, there's no, in the right side of the equation, for the inverse trig derivatives, there are no trig functions like there are for the trig derivatives. It's all just functions of x. So effectively, on the right side of the equal sign, the rule just becomes make it negative. And you can see that here. Positive 1 over square root 1 minus x squared. Same thing over here for arc cosine, it's just the negative. And that pattern is true between each one of these pairs. So there you go. Instead of having to rote memorize 12 different things, you now only have to rote memorize 6 different things. So before you had to rote memorize 6 trig derivatives and 6 inverse trig derivatives. Now you only need to rote memorize 3 of each, and then you can use this special trick to get the other half, basically. Now the downside of this, of course, is that you still have to rote memorize things. You still have to rote memorize half of the trig derivatives. If you forget those, this technique fails. So you're in trouble if you forget those. Now the question is, what do you do if you actually do forget some of those? If you forget some of the half that you're supposed to remember to make this technique work, what do you do then? Well, the answer is that in most cases, you can actually recover from that without a massive amount of work. So it is still worth doing that if you blank on a test. And in the next couple videos, we'll explain exactly how to do that. So hopefully that makes sense. Feel free to use this on your tests, and I will catch you next time.